Emily's fever spiked again last night. The nurse's voice broke through Ethan Carter's focus. He glanced up from his laptop, the screen filled with columns of numbers and corporate charts that demanded his attention. "We're adjusting her medication, but she didn't sleep much." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached for his coffee cup, now lukewarm, and took a small sip as if that would steady the storm of emotions he refused to acknowledge. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor of his sprawling penthouse. "Thank you," he said curtly. "I'll check on her later." The nurse hesitated. "Mr. Carter, she's asking for you." "She's been asking since." "Later," Ethan repeated, his tone final. He walked out of the room, leaving the nurse standing by the doorway, unsure whether to press further. Ethan paced down the hallway toward his office, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. This house, perched high above Manhattan with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline, felt like a mausoleum. It had been lifeless since the day his wife died 2 years ago, taking all warmth and joy with her. Now it was just him, his endless work, and Emily, a fragile reminder of the life he'd once had but could no longer bear to face. But he couldn't ignore her forever. Emily's illness wasn't going away. The doctors had been blunt. She needed care around the clock, someone patient, loving, present. Traits he knew he couldn't provide. Not while he was drowning in the demands of his multi-billion-dollar empire, Carter International. Later that evening, after his board meeting wrapped and his inbox was momentarily cleared, Ethan opened Emily's bedroom door. The sight hit him harder than he anticipated. His 5-year-old daughter lay curled under a pile of blankets, her pale face illuminated by the faint glow of a bedside lamp. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. A stuffed rabbit, one of the last gifts from her mother, was clutched in her small hands. "Daddy?" Her voice was soft, barely audible. Ethan forced a smile, stepping inside. "Hey, sweetheart." She looked up at him, her eyes duller than he remembered. "Will you stay?" Ethan hesitated, his throat tightening. He knelt beside the bed, smoothing her hair back from her damp forehead. "I can't tonight, Emily, but I'll find someone who can. Someone who will take care of you all the time. Would you like that?" Her lips quivered. "Will they tell stories?" "Mommy used to tell me stories. I'll make sure they do," Ethan promised, though his voice faltered. He kissed her forehead, stood, and left the room before she could see his composure crack. The next morning, Ethan's assistant, Sarah, met him in his office with a stack of resumes. "I've narrowed it down to 5 candidates, all experienced in childcare, with excellent references." Ethan barely glanced at the papers. "Choose one and start the paperwork." "Ethan," Sarah said, her tone firmer than usual, "you need to meet them first. Emily needs more than credentials. She needs someone who will connect with her." Ethan sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Fine. Set up interviews for this afternoon." By the time Lily Hayes walked into his office, Ethan was ready to dismiss her as he had the others. But something about her stopped him. She was younger than he expected, maybe mid-20s, with an open expression and an energy that felt out of place in his sterile, controlled world. "Mr. Carter," she said, holding his gaze. "I'm grateful for this opportunity." Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Why do you want this job?" Lily hesitated for a fraction of a second, then spoke with quiet conviction. "I love working with kids. I believe in making their lives brighter, no matter the circumstances." He didn't trust idealism, but there was something disarming about her candor. "Emily is not an easy child to care for." "I understand," Lily said, "but I'm not looking for easy. I'm looking for meaningful." Ethan tapped his pen against his desk, weighing her words. "We'll see how you handle it. The job's yours on a trial basis." Lily's smile was genuine. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. I won't let you down." Ethan nodded, already wondering if he was making a mistake. He couldn't afford to hope, not for himself and certainly not for Emily. But as Lily left the room, her confidence lingering in the air, a small, unacknowledged part of him wondered if he might have just made the right decision after all. The morning air in the Carter penthouse was as quiet as ever. The only sounds were the faint hum of appliances and the occasional footsteps of house staff moving about in their muted routines. But the silence broke when Lily Hayes arrived, a bright presence that felt entirely out of place in the meticulously cold environment Ethan had created. Sarah greeted her at the door, taking Lily's coat with a knowing smile. "You'll want to follow me," she said, gesturing toward the expansive living room where Ethan stood waiting. His expression was unreadable as he glanced up from his tablet, his usual armor of detachment firmly in place. "Mr. Carter," Lily began, her voice steady but warm. "Thank you again for this opportunity." Ethan nodded curtly. "Emily's room is down the hall. She's still asleep. Sarah will give you a tour of the house and explain your responsibilities." "I'd like to meet her first," Lily interrupted gently, surprising both Ethan and Sarah. Her tone wasn't demanding, but there was a firmness that Ethan wasn't used to hearing. He raised an eyebrow. "Emily is recovering from a difficult night. She needs rest." "Of course," Lily replied, undeterred. "But I'd like her to see a friendly face when she wakes up. It might help her feel less alone." Ethan hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly. He wasn't accustomed to anyone questioning his authority, much less someone he'd only just hired. But before he could respond, Sarah stepped in. "Why don't I show Lily the kitchen while we wait for Emily to wake?" Sarah suggested, her voice smooth and diplomatic. Lily nodded, understanding the unspoken boundary she had just brushed against. "That sounds great." As they left the room, Ethan returned to his tablet, though his focus was now splintered. He wasn't sure if Lily's approach was admirable or naive, but he couldn't deny the flicker of curiosity she had sparked. Later that morning, Lily finally stood at the threshold of Emily's bedroom. The sight before her was sobering. Emily was smaller than Lily had imagined, her frailty accentuated by the oversized bed and the medical equipment tucked discreetly in the corners of the room. Her blonde hair, damp from a recent fever, clung to her pale skin. But even in sleep, her features were delicate and lovely, a bittersweet reflection of a childhood interrupted. Lily approached slowly, her footsteps soft on the carpeted floor. She crouched beside the bed, watching as Emily stirred slightly, her small hand tightening around the stuffed rabbit she clung to. "Good morning, Emily," Lily said softly, her voice lilting with warmth. Emily's eyelids fluttered open, revealing tired, glassy eyes. She blinked at Lily, her expression wary but curious. "Who are you?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Lily," she replied, smiling. "Your dad asked me to come and spend time with you. I was hoping we could be friends." Emily didn't respond right away. Instead, she studied Lily with an intensity that seemed far too wise for her age. Finally, she nodded, her grip on the rabbit loosening slightly. "You can stay," Emily said, her tone as matter-of-fact as any 5-year-old trying to assert control in a world that often left her powerless. "Thank you," Lily replied, settling into a chair beside the bed. "I'm really glad to be here." By mid-afternoon, Ethan received an update from Sarah. "Lily's been with Emily all morning," Sarah informed him. "They're reading together now. Emily seems calmer than usual." Ethan frowned slightly, not out of disapproval, but out of a lingering sense of disbelief. "It's her first day," he said, brushing off Sarah's optimism. "We'll see how long it lasts." But as the day stretched into evening, Ethan found himself drawn to Emily's room. He lingered just outside the door, his hand hovering over the doorknob. From inside, he could hear Lily's voice, steady and animated, reading aloud from a children's book. Emily's soft laughter followed, a sound Ethan hadn't heard in months. He stepped back, his chest tightening. Part of him wanted to walk in, to see for himself what had changed. But the other part, the part that had grown adept at building walls, kept him rooted where he stood. Instead, he turned and walked away, his hands clenched in his pockets. That night, as Lily prepared to leave, she found Ethan waiting for her in the foyer. His posture was rigid, his expression unreadable, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something Lily couldn't quite place. "How did it go?" he asked, his tone neutral. "Emily is a wonderful child," Lily said without hesitation. "She's smart, imaginative, and braver than I expected." Ethan nodded slowly. She likes you. That's rare. I'm glad, Lily replied. But it's just the beginning. Building trust takes time. Ethan studied her for a moment, then spoke, his voice quieter than before. Emily doesn't trust easily. Neither do I. Lily held his gaze, understanding the unspoken weight of his words. I'm not going anywhere, Mr. Carter. You have my word. Ethan didn't respond, but the slight dip of his head was acknowledgement enough. As Lily left, the penthouse felt a little less empty than it had the day before. The next morning, Ethan's usual routine was interrupted by an unexpected sound: laughter. Not the polite, rehearsed kind exchanged in boardrooms, but genuine, uninhibited laughter. It echoed faintly down the hall, originating from Emily's room. Ethan paused mid-step, his coffee cup in hand, and frowned. He had grown accustomed to the muted stillness of the penthouse. Noise, especially joyful noise, felt foreign. Without thinking, he followed the sound until he was standing just outside Emily's partially open door. Inside, Lily was crouched on the floor, surrounded by an explosion of crayons, sketch pads, and scraps of colored paper. Emily sat cross-legged beside her, holding a piece of paper in her hands, her eyes sparkling with delight. What do you think, Lily? Does it look like Bun Bun? Emily asked, holding up her drawing of the stuffed rabbit she rarely let out of her grasp. Lily squinted, pretending to study the drawing with exaggerated seriousness. It's uncanny. If Bun Bun had a twin, I'd say this is it, Emily giggled, clutching the paper to her chest. I'm going to show Daddy later. Ethan's grip on his coffee cup tightened. He hadn't been prepared for this. For Emily to seem so alive, so full of energy. It wasn't that he didn't want her to feel joy. He just didn't know how to share it with her anymore. He turned away before they could notice him and retreated to his office. By mid-afternoon, Ethan was once again absorbed in work, a flurry of emails and financial reports demanding his attention. But his focus faltered when his assistant, Sarah, entered the room. Mr. Carter, there's something I think you should see, she said, holding out a tablet. Ethan frowned but took it. The screen displayed a short video clip taken by one of the house staff. It showed Emily and Lily in the living room, dancing together to a cheerful tune playing from a speaker. Emily's movements were slow and careful, but her face was alight with happiness. Lily twirled around her, clapping and laughing, encouraging Emily to keep going. Ethan watched in silence, his chest tightening. He couldn't remember the last time he had seen Emily so animated. He set the tablet down and looked at Sarah. "Why are you showing me this?" he asked, his tone sharper than intended. Sarah didn't flinch. "Because it's working. Lily is reaching her. She's bringing life back into this house." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his expression guarded. "It's only been a few days. Let's not jump to conclusions." Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "Of course. But maybe it's worth stepping away from your desk to see it for yourself." Ethan said nothing, and Sarah left quietly. The video lingered on the screen, but Ethan didn't watch it again. Instead, he turned his attention back to his work, though his focus remained fractured. That evening, Ethan found himself at the dinner table with Emily and Lily for the first time in months. It was an arrangement Lily had insisted on, citing the importance of shared meals and fostering connection. Ethan had reluctantly agreed, though he felt out of place in the cozy atmosphere Lily had created. Emily was chattering about the crafts they had made earlier, her words tumbling out in a stream of excitement. Ethan listened, occasionally nodding or offering a quiet "that's nice." But he couldn't shake the feeling that he was an intruder in his own home. "And then Lily said we could make a storybook," Emily exclaimed, looking at her father with wide eyes. "We're going to draw pictures and write about Bun Bun's adventures." "That sounds creative," Ethan said, his voice stiff. Lily smiled, sensing his discomfort, but choosing not to address it directly. "Emily has a vivid imagination. She came up with the idea all on her own." Emily beamed, clearly pleased with the praise. "Daddy, do you want to see the first page?" Ethan hesitated, caught off guard. "Maybe later," he said, his tone non-committal. Emily's face fell slightly, but Lily quickly redirected the conversation. "We'll save it for you, Mr. Carter. You'll be our first reader when it's done." Ethan nodded, grateful for the lifeline. As the meal continued, he couldn't help but notice how seamlessly Lily navigated Emily's moods, keeping her engaged and upbeat. It was a skill he envied, though he would never admit it. Later that night, Ethan sat alone in his office, staring at the framed photo of his late wife on his desk. It was one of the few personal touches in the otherwise sterile room. Her absence felt as heavy as ever, a constant reminder of everything he had lost, and everything he feared losing again. Lily's voice echoed in his mind. Emily has a vivid imagination. Ethan closed his eyes, trying to push the thought away. He had built his life on control, on predictability. Imagination had no place in his carefully constructed world. But as much as he wanted to dismiss Lily's influence, he couldn't ignore the change in Emily. For the first time in years, she was smiling, laughing, dreaming, and that terrified him. The following morning, Ethan was in the kitchen when Lily walked in, her usual energy subdued. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," she said, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "Good morning," he replied, glancing at her. "How's Emily?" "She's doing well," Lily said, though her smile was faint. "She's asking for you, by the way. She wants to show you her storybook." Ethan hesitated, his instinct to retreat warring with a quieter, unfamiliar urge to engage. "I'll stop by later." Lily set down her coffee cup and met his gaze. "She doesn't need later, Mr. Carter. She needs now." Ethan bristled at her tone, but couldn't deny the truth in her words. Without responding, he left the kitchen and headed toward Emily's room. The thought of facing her filled him with unease, but as he stood outside her door, he took a deep breath and stepped inside. Emily looked up from her bed, her face lighting up when she saw him. "Daddy, look what I made." She held up the first page of her storybook, a colorful drawing of Bun Bun in a magical forest. Ethan walked over, his steps slow but steady, and sat down beside her. "It's wonderful," he said, his voice softer than usual. Emily beamed, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan allowed himself to smile back. The next week brought a strange rhythm to the Carter household, one that Ethan couldn't quite explain. The once silent halls were now filled with murmurs of laughter, the rustle of crayons on paper, and Emily's voice as she recited bits of stories. The change wasn't dramatic, but it was steady, as if life had cautiously re-entered the space. For Ethan, however, this new normal felt disorienting. He had spent years building walls between his grief and his responsibilities, between himself and Emily. Now, those walls felt less stable, and the person chipping away at them was Lily Hayes. That morning, Ethan had barely sat down at the breakfast table when Lily arrived, holding a notebook in her hands. She was dressed casually, her hair tied back, but her expression carried a purpose that Ethan had come to associate with her. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," she said, sliding the notebook onto the table in front of him. Ethan glanced at it, then back at her. "What's this?" "It's Emily's storybook," Lily replied. "She finished the first chapter last night and insisted I show it to you." Ethan opened the notebook, his gaze falling on the carefully drawn illustrations and the uneven, slightly wobbly handwriting. It was a whimsical tale about Bun Bun traveling through a magical forest, meeting animals who helped him on his journey. Despite himself, Ethan felt a small smile tug at the corners of his mouth. "She's been working hard on it," Lily said, watching him closely. "It's the most excited I've seen her in a while." "It's impressive," Ethan admitted, closing the notebook. "She's creative." "She's more than that," Lily said gently. "She's hopeful. And that's not something every child in her situation can claim." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Her situation is precisely why I prefer to be realistic." "Realistic doesn't mean giving up on hope," Lily countered. "Emily doesn't need you to shield her from her reality. She needs you to believe in the possibilities she's dreaming of." Ethan set the notebook aside, his expression hardening. "I hired you to care for Emily, not to lecture me." Lily didn't flinch. "And I'm doing exactly that. But caring for her means advocating for her, even when it's uncomfortable." "Especially when it's uncomfortable." Ethan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Without another word, he left the room, his mind a tangle of frustration and doubt. Later that day, Ethan sat in his office, staring at the photo of his wife. He ran a hand through his hair, the weight of Lily's words pressing on him. She wasn't wrong. He knew that, but knowing it didn't make it easier to face. A soft knock at the door broke his thoughts. He looked up to see Emily standing there, clutching her storybook. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice hesitant. "Of course," Ethan said, motioning for her to enter. Emily walked over to his desk, climbing onto the chair across from him. She set the storybook down and opened it to a blank page. "I want to write more, but I don't know what happens next." Ethan leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "What's Bun Bun trying to do?" Emily tilted her head thoughtfully. "He's looking for the rainbow tree. Mommy used to tell me about it. She said it was a magical tree that could make wishes come true." Ethan's throat tightened at the mention of his late wife, but he pushed the emotion aside. "That sounds like a good adventure." Emily nodded. "But I don't know what Bun Bun should do when he finds it." Ethan hesitated, then said, "Maybe he asks the tree for something that helps him and his friends. Something that makes their world better." Emily's face lit up. "That's a great idea. Will you help me write it?" The question caught Ethan off guard. He had never considered himself the creative type, and the thought of contributing to her whimsical tale felt far removed from his comfort zone. But when he saw the hope in Emily's eyes, he found himself nodding. "Okay," he said. "Let's figure it out together." Over the next hour, Ethan and Emily worked side by side, brainstorming ideas for Bun Bun's adventure. For the first time in years, Ethan allowed himself to let go of his tightly controlled demeanor. He laughed when Emily suggested that the rainbow tree might talk and offered his own idea about a mischievous squirrel who tries to steal Bun Bun's map. By the time they finished the chapter, Emily was practically glowing with excitement. She threw her arms around Ethan's neck in a spontaneous hug, catching him completely off guard. "Thank you, Daddy," she said. "This was the best day ever." Ethan held her close, his heart aching with a mixture of joy and regret. He had spent so much time pushing her away, convinced that distance would protect them both from the pain of loss. But in that moment, he realized how much he had been missing. That evening, Ethan found Lily in the kitchen, tidying up after dinner. She looked up as he entered, her expression cautious. "I owe you an apology," Ethan said, his voice low. "You were right. About everything." Lily blinked, clearly surprised. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. That means a lot." Ethan hesitated, then added, "I joined Emily today. We worked on her story together." Lily's face softened into a smile. "That's wonderful. How did it go?" "It was good," Ethan admitted. "Better than I expected." Lily nodded. "She's been waiting for that, you know? For you to be part of her world." "I didn't think I had it in me," Ethan said quietly. "But maybe it's time I tried." Lily reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "It's never too late, Mr. Carter. Emily doesn't need perfect. She just needs you." As Ethan left the kitchen, her words echoed in his mind. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of something he couldn't quite name. Hope, perhaps. Or maybe something even deeper. The following weeks brought an undeniable shift in the Carter household. Ethan found himself spending more time with Emily, their shared moments no longer feeling forced or awkward. He even began joining her and Lily for dinners, something that had once seemed inconceivable. The walls Ethan had built so carefully were slowly crumbling, and though he wouldn't admit it, a part of him was relieved. But change, as Ethan was learning, rarely comes without resistance. One late afternoon, as Ethan wrapped up a video call in his office, Sarah appeared at the door, her expression cautious. "Mr. Carter," she began, stepping inside. "We need to talk about the funding for Emily's treatment." Ethan frowned, setting his tablet aside. "What about it?" Sarah hesitated before continuing. "There's an experimental therapy that Emily's doctor is recommending. It's not FDA approved yet, but the results from early trials are promising." "How promising?" Ethan asked, his voice sharp. "Significant improvement in similar cases," Sarah replied. "But it's expensive, and there's no guarantee." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. He had always been a man of logic and certainty, and this situation offered neither. The thought of pouring money into something that might not work, and exposing Emily to additional risks left him uneasy. "Schedule a meeting with her doctor," Ethan said finally. "I'll need all the details before making a decision." Sarah nodded, sensing the tension in his tone. "Of course." That evening, Ethan found Lily in the living room with Emily. They were sitting on the floor, sorting through a box of old photographs that had been stored away for years. Emily held up a picture of her mother, her small fingers tracing the edges of the photo. "Mommy was so pretty," Emily said softly. "Do you think she'd like my story, Daddy?" Ethan knelt beside her, his throat tightening at the sight of his late wife's smiling face. "She would have loved it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She always believed in your imagination." Emily smiled, tucking the photo into the notebook where she kept her storybook. "Then I'll make it the best story ever. So Mommy will be proud." Lily glanced at Ethan, her eyes filled with quiet encouragement. He nodded slightly, grateful for her presence even if he couldn't bring himself to say it aloud. The meeting with Emily's doctor the next morning was both hopeful and sobering. The therapy offered a real chance of improvement, but it came with risks, side effects that could be severe, and no guarantees of success. As Ethan listened to the doctor's explanation, his mind churned with conflicting thoughts. Afterward, Ethan found himself standing by the hospital's windows, staring out at the bustling city below. Lily stood beside him, her expression thoughtful. "What are you thinking?" she asked after a moment of silence. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know if I can take the chance. What if it makes things worse? What if I lose her anyway?" Lily placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding. "What if it works? What if this gives her the future she deserves?" Ethan shook his head, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. "I've already lost so much. I don't know if I can handle losing her too." "Ethan," Lily said gently, her use of his first name catching his attention. "Emily isn't asking you to protect her from every possibility. She's asking you to believe in her, to fight for her." Her words struck a chord, but Ethan couldn't bring himself to respond. Instead, he turned back to the window, his thoughts a storm he couldn't quiet. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He wandered into his office, the dim light of the city casting shadows across the room. On his desk sat Emily's storybook, the pages filled with her vibrant illustrations and hopeful words. He flipped through the pages, pausing on a drawing of Bun Bun standing before the rainbow tree. In Emily's handwriting, the caption read, "Bun Bun knew he was scared, but he also knew he had to try." Ethan closed the book, his chest tight. His daughter's courage, her unwavering belief in a better future, put his own doubts to shame. He knew what he had to do. The next morning, Ethan gathered Lily and Sarah in the living room. Emily was still asleep, the house quiet except for the faint hum of the heater. "I've made my decision," Ethan said, his voice steady. "We'll move forward with the therapy." Lily's face lit up with a mixture of relief and gratitude. "That's the right choice, Ethan. Emily deserves this chance." Sarah nodded, already making notes on her tablet. "I'll handle the logistics. We'll get everything scheduled as soon as possible." Ethan looked at Lily, his expression softer than she had ever seen it. "Thank you for reminding me what's important." Lily smiled, her voice warm. "You didn't need reminding, Ethan. You just needed to see it." That evening, Ethan sat by Emily's bedside, watching her sleep. Her breathing was steady, her small hands clutching Bun Bun tightly. For the first time in a long while, Ethan allowed himself to hope, not just for her recovery, but for the life they could build together. As he leaned down to kiss her forehead, he whispered, "We'll get through this, Emily. I promise." The day of Emily's first therapy session arrived with a weight that hung over the Carter household like a cloud. Ethan's meticulous preparation didn't alleviate his anxiety. His usual calm demeanor had been replaced with an air of quiet unease. Lily, ever perceptive, stepped in to take charge of Emily's morning routine, ensuring the little girl felt at ease. Emily, however, seemed remarkably calm. As she sat at the breakfast table, munching on toast and chatting with Bun Bun, her bright demeanor was a stark contrast to the tension swirling around her. "Daddy," Emily said, her voice breaking through Ethan's reverie. "Do you think Bun Bun can come with me today?" Ethan glanced at the stuffed rabbit sitting on the table beside her. Of course, he said. Bun Bun wouldn't miss it. Emily beamed, hugging the toy tightly. Then I'm not scared. Lily, standing by the counter, exchanged a brief look with Ethan. Her expression held quiet admiration for Emily's resilience, but it also carried an unspoken challenge: match her bravery. The drive to the clinic was quiet, the air in the car heavy with unspoken thoughts. Emily sat in the back seat, humming softly as she clutched Bun Bun. Ethan gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes fixed on the road, while Lily sat beside him, her presence steady and reassuring. When they arrived, a nurse greeted them with a warm smile and guided them to a private waiting room. Emily climbed onto a plush chair, swinging her legs as she examined the room's colorful murals. Ethan sat beside her, his knee bouncing with nervous energy. "Daddy," Emily said, tilting her head, "why are you fidgeting?" Ethan froze, caught off guard by her observation. "I'm just thinking," he said, attempting a smile. Emily reached over and placed her small hand on his. "It's okay. You don't have to worry so much. I'll be brave." Ethan swallowed hard, her words hitting him like a punch to the chest. "You're already the bravest person I know." The therapy session was a carefully orchestrated process. The medical team explained each step to Ethan and Lily, answering questions and ensuring they understood what to expect. Emily remained calm throughout, her trust in the adults around her unwavering. As the session began, Ethan stood behind the observation window, watching as the doctors administered the treatment. Emily lay on a padded table, clutching Bun Bun while one of the nurses spoke to her in soothing tones. Despite the sterile environment, she looked remarkably at ease. Lily stood beside Ethan, her gaze focused on Emily. "She's incredible," she said softly. Ethan nodded, his throat tight. "She is." For the first time, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of his daughter's courage, despite everything she had been through. Losing her mother, facing a life-altering illness, Emily's spirit remained unbroken. It was a humbling realization. After the session, Emily emerged with a tired but triumphant smile. "It didn't even hurt that much," she declared, holding Bun Bun up like a trophy. Ethan knelt in front of her, his hands resting on her shoulders. "I'm so proud of you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Emily grinned. "Does that mean I get extra ice cream tonight?" Lily laughed softly from behind them. "I think that's a fair request." Ethan smiled, standing and ruffling Emily's hair. "Ice cream it is." That evening, the three of them sat around the kitchen table, sharing bowls of Emily's favorite flavor, chocolate chip cookie dough. The mood was light, a welcome reprieve from the day's earlier tension. Emily regaled them with a detailed account of Bun Bun's bravery during the session, her animated storytelling drawing laughter from both adults. As Emily finished her story, she looked up at Ethan with wide eyes. "Daddy, do you think Mommy can see me from heaven?" The question caught Ethan off guard. He set his spoon down, his expression softening. "I think she can," he said gently, "and I think she's really proud of you." Emily smiled, her eyes shining. "Then I'll keep being brave, so she can see." Ethan reached across the table, taking her small hand in his. "You've already made her proud, Emily. Every single day." Later that night, after Emily had gone to bed, Ethan found himself in the living room, staring at a photo of his late wife. Lily entered quietly, carrying 2 mugs of tea. She handed one to him and sat down on the couch. "You're doing a great job, Ethan," she said, breaking the silence. Ethan shook his head. "I don't know if I am. I've spent so long keeping her at arm's length, trying to protect her by staying distant. It feels like I'm just now figuring out how to be her father." Lily set her mug down and turned to face him. "What matters is that you're here now. Emily doesn't need perfection. She just needs you to keep showing up." Ethan looked at her, her words sinking in. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope, not just for Emily's recovery, but for their future as a family. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything." Lily smiled, her voice warm. "You don't have to thank me. I'm just glad I can help." As the night wore on, Ethan sat with Lily in comfortable silence, the weight of the day finally beginning to lift. For the first time, He allowed himself to believe that they might just get through this together. The days following Emily's first therapy session were a delicate dance of hope and uncertainty. While the initial procedure had gone smoothly, the waiting period for results loomed large, testing everyone's patience. Ethan buried himself in work, trying to maintain a sense of control, but the distraction was only partially effective. Meanwhile, Lily became the anchor in the household, quietly managing the day-to-day and ensuring Emily's spirits stayed high. One afternoon, Ethan was in his home office, sifting through reports that blurred together in his mind. His concentration was broken by the sound of his phone buzzing. It was Sarah. "Mr. Carter." Sarah's voice was calm but carried an edge of urgency. "There's something you should know." Ethan leaned forward, tension coiling in his chest. "What is it?" "I've been reviewing the logistics and budgeting for Emily's therapy," she began. "And there's a discrepancy. A substantial one." Ethan frowned, his grip tightening on the phone. "What kind of discrepancy?" "There's an external party involved," Sarah said carefully. "A donor. They've been covering a significant portion of the costs." Ethan's pulse quickened. "Who?" Sarah hesitated before replying. "It's Lily." The revelation hit Ethan like a thunderclap. He ended the call abruptly and sat back in his chair, his mind racing. Why hadn't she told him? Was this some kind of pity or charity? The question swirled, fueling his frustration and insecurity. That evening, Ethan confronted Lily in the kitchen. She was standing by the counter, chopping vegetables for dinner. When she saw the expression on his face, she set the knife down and wiped her hands on a towel. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Why didn't you tell me?" Ethan's tone was sharp, and Lily blinked in surprise. "Tell you what? That you've been paying for Emily's therapy," he said, his voice low but intense. Lily's face softened with understanding. She took a deep breath before responding. "I wasn't trying to hide it, Ethan. I just didn't think it was important." "Not important?" he repeated, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "You went behind my back to fund something I should have been handling." "I wasn't trying to undermine you," Lily said firmly. "I saw an opportunity to help, and I took it. This isn't about you or me. It's about Emily." Ethan paced the room, his emotions a tangled mess. "Do you have any idea how this makes me feel? Like I've failed as her father. Like I can't take care of my own daughter." Lily stepped closer, her voice calm but unwavering. "Ethan, this isn't about your pride. It's about giving Emily the best chance she has. That's what matters." He stopped and looked at her, his frustration giving way to vulnerability. "I've spent my whole life trying to control everything, to fix things. And now, I feel like I'm failing at the one thing that matters most." Lily placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding. "You're not failing, Ethan. You're doing everything you can. But sometimes, it's okay to accept help. It doesn't make you weak. It makes you human." Ethan sighed, his shoulders sagging. For a moment, he allowed himself to lean into her words, to consider the possibility that she was right. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for helping Emily, for helping us." Lily gave him a small, reassuring smile. "You don't have to thank me. I'm here because I care about both of you. That's all." Over the next few days, the tension between Ethan and Lily began to ease. Their conversations grew less guarded, their shared moments more genuine. Ethan started to see Lily not just as an employee or caretaker, but as someone who had become an integral part of their lives. One evening, as they sat in the living room watching Emily color in one of her storybooks, Ethan found himself marveling at the way Lily had seamlessly woven herself into their family dynamic. She wasn't just a helper. She was a source of light in their darkest moments. "Daddy," Emily said, breaking the silence, "can Lily come with us to the park tomorrow?" Ethan glanced at Lily, who looked surprised but pleased by the request. "If she wants to," he said. "I'd love to," Lily replied, her smile warm. The outing to the park was a welcome respite from the heaviness that had hung over them for so long. Emily ran ahead, laughing as she chased a flock of pigeons. Ethan and Lily walked side by side, their conversation easy and unforced. "Thank you for coming," Ethan said after a while. "It means a lot to her." Lily looked at him, her eyes kind. "It means a lot to me too." As they watched Emily play, Ethan felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. It wasn't just for Emily's recovery, but for the possibility of a future that didn't feel so lonely. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine a life where they weren't just surviving but truly living. And in that moment, he realized that Lily was a part of that vision. Ethan had always considered himself a man of logic, someone who could rely on patterns, order, and control to navigate life's chaos. But the past few months had unraveled those certainties, leaving him grappling with emotions he had long kept buried. His growing reliance on Lily wasn't just practical, it was emotional. And that terrified him. It was during one of his late-night work sessions that the unease began to gnaw at him. He sat in his office, reviewing a report on a new investment, but the words blurred together. His thoughts kept returning to Lily, the way she had stood firm during their argument, the quiet kindness in her every action, the warmth she had brought into their lives. Was it gratitude he felt, or something deeper? His musings were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Before he could answer, Lily peeked her head in. "Sorry to bother you," she said, holding a steaming mug. "I thought you might need a break." Ethan blinked, surprised. "Thank you," he said, taking the mug. Their fingers brushed briefly, sending a jolt through him. She hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. "You've been working late a lot. Are you okay?" He leaned back in his chair, the weight of the question pressing on him. "I don't know," he admitted. "I keep thinking about everything that's happened, everything that's still uncertain. It's overwhelming." Lily sat down in the chair across from him. "You don't have to do it all alone, Ethan. You've got people who care about you." "About Emily." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For a moment, Ethan considered sharing the thoughts swirling in his mind. The fears, the guilt, the burgeoning feelings he couldn't quite name. But the vulnerability felt too raw, too dangerous. "Thank you," he said instead, his tone carefully neutral. Lily studied him for a moment before nodding. "You should get some rest," she said as she stood. "Good night, Ethan." "Good night," he replied, watching her leave. As the door clicked shut, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The next morning, Ethan woke to the sound of Emily's laughter echoing through the house. He followed the noise to the living room, where he found Lily and Emily building an elaborate fort out of blankets and cushions. "Daddy," Emily called, waving him over. "Look what we made." Ethan smiled, his heart warming at the sight. "It's impressive," he said. "Does it have a name?" Emily nodded enthusiastically. "It's the Bun Bun Castle." Lily chuckled, adjusting one of the blankets. "It's very exclusive. Only the bravest knights are allowed in." "Well, I'll have to prove my bravery, then," Ethan said, sitting on the floor to join them. As they played, Ethan couldn't help but notice the ease with which Lily interacted with Emily. She didn't just care for her. She genuinely connected with her, meeting her on her level and making her feel safe. It was something Ethan had struggled with, and seeing it come so naturally to Lily both comforted and unnerved him. That afternoon, as Emily napped, Ethan found himself drawn to the kitchen, where Lily was tidying up. He leaned against the counter, watching her for a moment before speaking. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice cautious, "about what you said last night. About not doing this alone." Lily paused, glancing at him. And I think you're right," he admitted. "I've spent so much time trying to be strong for Emily, trying to keep everything together, that I've forgotten how to let people in." Her expression softened. "It's not easy, letting go of that control, but you don't have to carry it all on your own." He nodded, the truth of her words settling in. "I just don't want to let her down. Or you." "You won't," she said firmly. "You've already shown her how much you love her. That's what matters." They stood in silence for a moment, the unspoken tension between them palpable. Ethan opened his mouth to say something more, but before he could, the sound of Emily's voice calling for them broke the moment. "Daddy, Lily, come quick." They exchanged a look before hurrying to Emily's room. They found her sitting up in bed, clutching Bun Bun with wide eyes. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Ethan asked, sitting beside her. "I had a bad dream," Emily said, her voice trembling. It felt so real. Ethan wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "It's okay, Emily. It was just a dream. You're safe." Lily sat on the other side of the bed, her presence steady and calming. "Do you want to talk about it?" Emily hesitated before nodding. "I dreamed that Mommy was trying to talk to me, but I couldn't hear her. She kept getting farther and farther away." Ethan's throat tightened. He glanced at Lily, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. "Sometimes dreams are just our way of trying to understand things we're feeling," Ethan said gently. "It doesn't mean anything bad. And no matter what, Mommy is always with you, in your heart." Emily looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Really? Really?" Ethan said, kissing the top of her head. "And so am I. Always." Lily reached out, brushing a strand of hair from Emily's face. "And so is Bun Bun. He's your knight, remember?" Emily smiled weakly, hugging her stuffed rabbit. "Thank you." As they sat with her, comforting her until she fell back asleep, Ethan felt a deep sense of gratitude for Lily's presence. She wasn't just helping Emily, she was helping him. And while the future remained uncertain, for the first time, he felt like he wasn't facing it alone. The following week brought unexpected tension to the Carter household. Though Emily's therapy sessions continued without issue, Ethan couldn't shake the undercurrent of unease that had taken root. His late-night reflections, the weight of his growing bond with Lily, and the ever-present fear for Emily's health created a pressure he couldn't ignore. And it finally began to show. One morning, Lily found Ethan in the kitchen earlier than usual, staring at his coffee as though it might reveal answers he couldn't find elsewhere. "You're up early," she said softly, setting a glass of juice on the counter for Emily. Ethan looked up, startled. "Couldn't sleep?" Lily studied him for a moment before sitting at the table. "Want to talk about it?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "It's nothing." Lily didn't press, but her concern lingered. Ethan had a way of carrying the world on his shoulders, and she wondered how much longer he could hold up under the weight. Later that day, Emily came bounding into the living room, her face lit with excitement. "Daddy, can we work on the storybook today? I thought of a new part." Ethan glanced up from his laptop, his expression distracted. "Not now, Emily. Maybe later." Emily's face fell. "But you promised." "I know," Ethan said, his tone sharper than he intended. "I said later." Lily, who had been tidying up nearby, saw the hurt flash across Emily's face. She knelt down beside the little girl, her voice gentle. "How about you tell me your idea, and we'll jot it down? Then Daddy can help us later." Emily nodded reluctantly, her excitement dimmed. As she and Lily moved to the other side of the room, Ethan's chest tightened with guilt. He wanted to make time for her, but his mind was too crowded with worries he couldn't shake. That evening, as Ethan worked late in his office, Lily knocked on the door and entered without waiting for an answer. She carried a piece of paper, one of Emily's drawings, and set it on his desk. "You need to take a break," she said firmly. "I'm busy," Ethan replied, not looking up. "Ethan, she's trying to connect with you," Lily said, her tone softer now. "And she needs you to meet her halfway." Ethan exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "I know. I don't want to let her down, or make promises I can't keep." "You're not letting her down by being present," Lily said. "She doesn't need you to be perfect. She just needs you." Her words struck a chord, but they also stirred something defensive in him. "You don't understand what it's like," he said, his voice low. "The pressure, the responsibility, knowing that every decision you make could change everything." "You're right," Lily said, surprising him with her agreement. "I don't know what it's like to be in your shoes, but I do know what it's like to care about someone so deeply that it scares you. And I know what it's like to feel helpless." Ethan looked at her, his frustration giving way to vulnerability. "How do you deal with it?" "I focus on what I can do," Lily said simply, "even if it's small, even if it's just being there when it matters most." Ethan nodded slowly, her words settling over him like a balm. "Thank you," he said after a moment, "for reminding me." Lily smiled, her expression warm. "That's what I'm here for." The next day, Ethan made a point to set aside his work and join Emily in the living room. She was sitting on the floor with her storybook, her face lighting up when she saw him. "Daddy, you're here," she said, her excitement contagious. "I'm here," Ethan said, sitting beside her. "Now, tell me about this new idea of yours." As Emily launched into her explanation, Ethan found himself drawn into her world. For the first time in days, he let go of his worries and focused solely on her. They laughed, sketched, and wrote together, their bond growing stronger with each moment. Lily watched from the doorway, her heart swelling at the sight. This was the Ethan she had glimpsed in quiet moments, the father who loved his daughter fiercely, even if he didn't always know how to show it. That night, after Emily had gone to bed, Ethan found Lily in the kitchen. He leaned against the counter, his expression thoughtful. "You were right," he said. "I've been so caught up in trying to fix everything that I forgot what's really important." Lily looked up from the dishes, her eyes kind. "It's not easy, balancing it all. But you're doing better than you think." Ethan hesitated, then said, "I couldn't do it without you. You've been more than just a caretaker. You've been everything we needed." Lily's cheeks flushed, but she met his gaze. "I'm glad I can help. You and Emily mean a lot to me." The sincerity in her voice left Ethan momentarily speechless. For the first time, he allowed himself to acknowledge the depth of his feelings. For her, for Emily, for the fragile, beautiful life they were building together. "Thank you," he said softly, "for staying, for caring." Lily smiled, her voice steady. "Always." It started as a small cough, the kind that could easily be dismissed as the result of an overly cold drink or too much excitement. But by the second day, Emily's cough had worsened, and by the third, it was accompanied by a fever that sent a chill of dread through the Carter household. Ethan stood by Emily's bedside, watching as she slept fitfully. Her tiny body was wrapped in blankets, her face flushed from the fever. He glanced at Lily, who sat on the other side of the bed, a damp cloth in her hand. "Her doctor said it could be a side effect," Ethan said, his voice strained. "But they can't know for sure." Lily nodded, her expression calm but focused. "We're doing everything we can. The important thing is keeping her comfortable." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, the weight of his helplessness pressing down on him. "What if this is more than just a side effect? What if—" "Ethan," Lily interrupted gently but firmly, "we can't let ourselves spiral. Emily needs us to stay strong for her." He nodded, though the words did little to ease the knot in his chest. "You're right. I don't know how much more of this I can take." Lily placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "You're not in this alone." As the night wore on, Ethan and Lily took turns sitting with Emily. Each hour felt like an eternity, the ticking of the clock amplifying the tension in the air. Ethan found himself pacing the living room during one of his breaks, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of fear and frustration. It was Sarah who finally broke the silence. She had come by to check on Emily, bringing groceries and supplies as a gesture of support. Now, she stood in the kitchen, watching Ethan with a concerned expression. "You need to rest," she said gently. "You're no good to Emily if you're running on fumes." Ethan shook his head. "I can't. Not while she's like this." Sarah sighed, her tone softening. "Ethan, I know you want to protect her, but part of that means taking care of yourself too." He didn't respond, the weight of her words sinking in. Before he could say anything, Lily entered the room, her expression calm but serious. "Her fever's stabilizing," she said, a note of relief in her voice. "She's still coughing, but she seems more comfortable." Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Thank God." Lily gave him a small smile. "She's tough, just like her dad." The comment caught Ethan off guard, but he managed a weak smile. "I don't feel very tough right now." Lily stepped closer, her eyes steady. "You are, even when you don't see it." By morning, Emily's fever had broken. She was still weak, but her color was returning, and her breathing was more steady. Ethan sat by her bed, holding her hand as she slept. When she finally opened her eyes, she gave him a small, tired smile. "Hi, Daddy." "Hi, sweetheart," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "You scared me." "I'm okay," Emily whispered. "Bun Bun stayed with me." Ethan glanced at the stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm, his chest tightening. "Bun Bun's a good protector." Emily nodded, her eyelids already drooping again. And so are you. As she drifted back to sleep, Ethan felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was tempered by the realization of just how fragile their world was. He couldn't afford to take anything for granted. Not her health, not the time they had together, not the people who had become so important to their lives. Later that day, as the house began to settle back into its usual rhythm, Ethan found Lily in the kitchen. She was washing dishes, her movements slow and deliberate. "Lily," he said, his voice breaking the quiet. She turned to face him, her expression soft but questioning. "Yes?" "Thank you," he said, the weight of the past few days evident in his tone. "For everything. I don't know how I would have gotten through this without you." Lily dried her hands, taking a step closer. "You don't have to thank me, Ethan. I care about Emily, and I care about you." Her words hung in the air, charged with meaning. Ethan searched her face, his own emotions threatening to spill over. For a moment, he considered saying what had been building in his heart for weeks, but fear held him back. Instead, he said, "I don't think I've ever told you how much you mean to us." "To me." Lily's eyes softened, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You don't have to say it, Ethan. I see it every day." They stood there, the silence between them filled with unspoken truths. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope, not just for Emily's recovery, but for the life they were building together, piece by fragile piece. The weeks that followed Emily's fever marked a turning point for Ethan. The scare had forced him to confront the fragility of life and the depth of his love for his daughter. It also clarified something he had been avoiding for far too long: his feelings for Lily. Emily's recovery was slow but steady. The therapy seemed to be working, her strength returning bit by bit. Her laughter, once faint and rare, now echoed through the house again. And with it came a growing bond between Ethan and Lily, forged in shared struggles and quiet moments of understanding. It was during one of those moments, as the three of them sat together on the living room floor, finishing another chapter of Emily's storybook, that Emily asked the question that changed everything. "Do you think the rainbow tree is real?" she asked, looking up at them with wide eyes. Lily smiled. "What do you think, Emily?" "I think it is," Emily said firmly. "And I think we should go find it." Ethan chuckled. "You've got quite the imagination, kiddo. But what if it's real?" Emily insisted. "Mommy used to say the best adventures are the ones you don't plan." Lily glanced at Ethan, her eyes twinkling. "She has a point." Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "All right, Emily, let's have an adventure." The next morning, they packed a picnic and drove to a nearby park with sprawling trails and thick forests. Emily, armed with her storybook and bun-bun, led the way, her excitement contagious. "This way," she called, pointing down a winding path. "The rainbow tree is this way. I just know it." Ethan and Lily followed, their pace slower but their spirits lighter. For Ethan, it was the first time in years that he felt fully present, unburdened by the weight of work and worry. For Lily, it was a moment of quiet joy, watching the two people she cared for most embrace the day with open hearts. As they walked, Emily recounted her favorite parts of the storybook, weaving new ideas as she went. Her imagination brought the forest to life, turning every tree and stream into part of the magical world she had created. Finally, they reached a clearing bathed in golden sunlight. In the center stood a massive oak tree with sprawling branches that seemed to touch the sky. Emily gasped, clutching Bun-Bun tightly. "It's the rainbow tree," she exclaimed, running toward it. Ethan and Lily exchanged a smile, then followed her to the tree. Emily placed her hand on the bark, her expression serious. "What should we wish for?" she asked, looking up at them. Lily knelt beside her. "I think that's up to you." Emily closed her eyes, her face scrunched in concentration. After a moment, she opened them and smiled. "I wished for all of us to be happy forever." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. He reached out, pulling Emily into a hug. "That's a perfect wish." As they sat under the tree, sharing sandwiches and listening to Emily's endless stories, Ethan realized he had found something he hadn't thought possible: peace. The kind that comes not from avoiding pain, but from embracing love, even when it feels risky. That evening, as they returned home, Emily fell asleep in the car, her head resting against Bun Bun. Ethan carried her to bed, tucking her in with a kiss on her forehead. When he turned, he found Lily standing in the doorway, watching them with a soft smile. "You're a great dad," she said. Ethan shook his head, his voice quiet. "I've made so many mistakes." "We all do," Lily replied. "What matters is how much you love her. And she knows." They walked to the living room, the weight of the day settling over them. Ethan hesitated, then turned to Lily. "I've been meaning to say something," he began, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "You've been more than a caretaker, more than someone who just stepped into our lives. You've made everything better, for Emily and for me." Lily's eyes glistened, but she stayed quiet, letting him continue. "I don't know where we'd be without you," he said, "and I don't want to imagine it." Lily stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "I care about you, Ethan, about both of you, more than I can say." The unspoken tension between them dissolved in that moment. Ethan reached for her hand, his gaze unwavering. "Stay," he said, "not just for Emily, for us." Tears slipped down Lily's cheeks, but her smile was radiant. "I was never planning to leave." Ethan pulled her into an embrace, the weight of the past giving way to a future that felt impossibly bright. Months later, Emily's health continued to improve, her strength returning with each passing day. Her storybook, now complete, sat proudly on the coffee table, a testament to her resilience and imagination. And in the Carter household, laughter and love filled every corner. One evening, as they sat together watching the sunset, Emily turned to Ethan and Lily, her face glowing with happiness. "I think my wish came true," she said. Ethan kissed the top of her head, his heart full. "So do I, sweetheart." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in hues of gold and pink, the three of them sat together, holding on to the one thing they had fought so hard to find: each other.